इधर से लगा, इधर से
नेटवर्क मिलना चाहिए ना।
इधर 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 ऊपर आजा। 98 अरे
क्या कर रहा है, बोल ना।
तेरे को लगा मैं भूल जाएगा ना। 9820365608
हाँ
लगा क्या?
एक्टिवेटेड। तेरे बाप का नाम एक्टिवेटेड।
बाप का नाम एक्टिवेटेड है। अपन निकले थे तो मितेश भाई था।
ये लाइन कहाँ जा रही है? Oh shit! ये क्या हो गया?
Where? 32 degrees north. 32 degrees north. Move to Kaba Hill. Move to Kaba Hill. That looks like a camp.
Is Taliban camp?
Spotted something, sir. 2 males, sir. 2 males.
Rifles were in fact British. The advantage of a British proof mark was not its indication of higher quality, because Belgian, German, and French rifles were all highly regarded around the Arabian Sea. Rather, British rifles passed through searches by British customs officers with greater ease than rifles from other European countries. Distinguishing which rifle was a legal import and which was not depended on a variety of complex and ambiguous calculations about the style of the weapon, the ammunition it took, the final purchaser, and how it would be used. The great difficulty of regulating firearms was that they were perfectly normal commodities in production and circulation and became problematic only in certain forms of consumption. Firearms consumed in hunting animals or games of sport were perfectly respectable consumer goods. But when firearms and ammunition were consumed in acts of murder, theft, or extortion, they presented a much more problematic commodity. Officials had to predict how the firearms would be used on the basis of the appearance of the weapon, and sometimes little more than a description. Customs officers depended on importers to be truthful and forthright in their declarations, and on vague categorizations to distinguish between commodities and coercive instruments. So rough heuristics, rules of thumb, had to compensate for the lack of prophetic ability. The most important heuristic device was simply that custom officials tended to trust manufacturers from their own nations, but various other easy, if imprecise, rules played a key role in the work of arms regulation. Arms traffickers were keenly aware of this difficulty of differentiating licit from illicit firearms, so they quickly found ways to manipulate these rules. One of the primary methods by which traffickers evaded regulations was the classic trope of concealing a weapon under other cargo. Firearms and ammunition were intensively regulated commodities, so merchants disguised their weapons as unregulated commodities. Ammunition could be concealed in virtually anything, and custom authorities had little chance of discovering it. Bullets were slipped into packages of dates, perfume, spices, and sundries, and were rarely discovered, while other shippers sent ammunition simply concealed in passengers' baggage or in boxes labeled packets and books. Rifles, on the other hand, were large and heavy objects that could not be easily concealed. Fortunately for smugglers, cotton was a major item of trade and easily concealed large firearms. When hidden within large bales of cotton, rifles were invisible to customs. The bales were so packed that they appeared to be exactly like those of piece goods which merchants generally dispatched by rail, but were found to contain, very cleverly arranged in separate pieces of straw, 2 military Martini-Henry rifles, 1 ordinary Martini-Henry rifle, 1 BL carbine, and 3,290 military ball cartridges. While the imperial administration became aware of this method of trafficking, the sheer volume of the cotton trade meant that they could do little about it. Similar cases of trafficking arms in cotton bales were uncovered between Muscat, Somalia, Iran, Bahrain, and other places. Another set of smugglers concealed small pistols in specially designed compartments cut out of the pages of a book. Whoa. This method had the benefit not only of being shipped via the postal system, but also of being shipped by the cheaper rate of book post rather than first-class mail. Given that this plot was uncovered in 1910, one wonders whether an Indian smuggler might be at the origin of this trope of spy novels. Given that this plot was uncovered in 1910, one wonders whether an Indian smuggler might be at the origin of this trope of spy novels. Winston Churchill admiringly recounted an escapade where rifles were smuggled in a coffin with a piece of rotting beef to approximate the smell of a corpse, as well as to discourage officials from investigating too thoroughly. Though some of these smugglers were particularly creative, ultimately their schemes all relied on making contraband visible to the regulators as unregulated commodities. British weapons were discriminated against on other shores of the Arabian Sea. This is kind of like the passport issue between US and Argentina. At the end of the 19th century, the Iranian Customs Administration was run by Belgians who appeared to be less rigorous in their regulation of Belgian weapons than of British weapons. Traders around the Arabian Sea recognized this tendency and were anxious to purchase Belgian rifles. This certainly contributed to the dominance of Belgian weapons in the Gulf at the turn of the 20th century. Moreover, arms traders utilized government markings to facilitate their transit through customs. Ratansi Purushottam and other merchants requested rifles engraved with the Qajar imperial seal to indicate a government purchase, whether or not the rifles were actually intended for the Qajar military. Yemen and Somalia, given their proximity to the French colony of Djibouti, were well supplied with French Gras rifles and their ammunition. Djibouti was the hub of arms trade for the East African coast and the Red Sea, and French administrators were only too willing to turn a blind eye to the thriving commerce that filled the government's coffers and those of French manufacturers. That French rifles could predominate in a British colony like Aden was deemed a failure, and British administrators were determined to correct this state of affairs. The political resident in Aden resolved that British arms should be liberally sold to tribal leaders at cost price so that they would have no reason to purchase French weapons. The language they used betrayed economic competition as the central impetus driving British arms policies. The resident recommended a full and sufficient supply of arms for the actual need of the tribes, which will compete in price and popularity with the French weapon. So, rather absurdly, the British methods of constraining the illicit arms traffic in Aden was to liberally provide Arabs with British weapons. Far from disarming the population, arms regulations frequently meant that colonial rulers dominated the supply of weapons to colonized consumers. The key dynamic seemed to be the competition between colonial bureaucracies to monitor and monopolize the distribution of arms. Regulation, as a method of promoting British industry, was particularly egregious in the case of ammunition. The black market for ammunition around the Arabian Sea was glutted with British military-issued cartridges. The frequency of pilfering, embezzling, and outright theft of government ammunition suggests that the Indian Army was quite liberal in distributing ammunition and unconcerned that its supplies were overloading into the illicit trade. It was widely known in Bombay that anyone who knew a soldier could not only purchase ammunition, but do so at military discount. Moreover, Belgian manufacturers designed rifles specifically to take British government cartridges in order to compete for markets around the Arabian Sea. The only explanation for this negligence seems to be that officers were so concerned that soldiers be liberally provisioned with ammunition that they were reluctant to impose too strict controls over supplies. Nevertheless, the negligent attitude toward government-issued ammunition subtly allowed the colonial government to stimulate British industry even as it threatened colonial property. Yet this promotion of British ammunition was also undercut by the maneuvers of local merchants and consumers. Arab and Indian consumers sought out Badal ammunition. Badal can be roughly translated as substitute. which indicated the spent cartridges of European ammunition that were reloaded with locally produced bullets. They're like the Belgians. Wow. These were cheap and plentiful because Arabs and Afghans were very careful to recover spent cartridges. As one official noted, it is interesting to observe how zealously an Arab Afar firing will collect his cartridge cases, and nothing will usually induce him to part with them. Indeed, empty cartridges became a commodity in and of themselves, with enterprising traders selling them at a profit in Afghanistan and Somalia. New British cartridges were known as wilayati in Muscat, a term that makes little sense in Arabic, but in Urdu this term indicates something English or European. These cartridges were comparatively expensive and were purchased only by wealthier gun owners. Imperial officials were incensed at the production of bundle ammunition and revised Indian statutes to prevent its production, which no doubt helped the sales of wilayati cartridges. The inconsistent policy of the British Empire with regard to the import of arms and ammunition was subtly tied to the effort to maintain the competitiveness of British industries. Administrators did not wish to regulate British exports when such actions would only mean the arms trade passing into the hands of other nations. Instead, they maintained a profitable tension between punishing arms traders in the Arabian Sea and promoting the arms industry back in Britain. The difference between licit and illicit arms trade was ultimately determined by the discretion of regulatory officials. None of the European states administering custom regimes around the Arabian littoral had an explicit agenda of promoting their national manufactures. Rather, custom officials simply trusted the manufacturers of their own nation and questioned the manufacturers of other nations. Merchant networks were, of course, quick to exploit this gap between regulatory categories and the nationalist biases in their interpretation. State/society. Until 1912, the Muscat Customs Farm was auctioned every year to the highest bidder, and Retency Purushottam frequently entered the winning bid. Almost without exception, the customs administration was farmed out to one of the handful of well-capitalized Bania firms operating in Muscat. As Muscat's customs revenues were propelled upwards by revenues from the arms trade, this position became ever more profitable. Indeed, the increase of the import duty on arms in 1897 was justified to British officials as a means of limiting the arms trade. Its actual effect was to increase the customs revenues collected by Retency Purushottam. Retency Purushottam's role as customs farmer not only was an additional source of revenue, but provided a number of vital benefits that came from exercising state authority. The firm administering the customs farm could import firearms without being taxed, so they had an upper hand against other importers. If the customs farmer was responsible for regulating the trade in firearms, there was little incentive to effectively administer regulations unless they increased revenues. As colonial officials attempted to secure a state monopoly on violence, they were undermined by the overlap between the state and the merchant networks they were regulating. The regulation of the arms trade was organized around a nebulous distinction between the state and the society it ruled. Colonial governments sought a monopoly on the use of violence, and they pursued this by limiting the ability of their subjects to purchase firearms. While the legislation was clear in its conceptual division of state from society, in practice this boundary was continually trespassed. The state was made up of individuals who were also part of society, and parts of society were routinely co-opted into the state apparatus. The racial dynamics of British colonialism separated out the European population of British colonies and effectively made them sovereign agents. Simultaneously, states often contracted out certain responsibilities to private commercial firms, like the Sultan of Muscat farming his customs to Retency Purushottam. This outsourced logistical hassle This outsourced logistical hassles, but government policy also became subject to the conflicting incentives of profit. Lastly, colonial bureaucrats recruited soldiers from the societies they governed. This fluctuating military population had to be armed and disarmed as their numbers changed in accordance with political exigencies. There was no state that was totally separate from society. Colonial efforts to define and control populations through taxation, military service, and racial preference produced the distinction between the state and the society that it ostensibly governed. This ambiguous state-society distinction was especially performed through efforts to monitor, manage, and monopolize the arms traffic. Thanks for listening. Take care. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day.